Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the weekly podcast Film Seizure that you can catch every Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Now, here's something that might be way overdue, and quite frankly, this is probably going to be a supersized episode for it, but on November 23rd, 1963, England's BBC television network broadcast the first 23-minute serial of a brand new science fiction series called Doctor Who. For the next 26 years, families would tune in to watch the mysterious time traveler, the Doctor, played by a total of 7 people in that 26 years, battle various villains and creatures to help save the universe. It became a part of multiple generations of children viewers during those years. Now, the premise was pretty simple. A mysterious old man, originally played by William Hartnell, traveled the galaxies with his granddaughter Susan. When her school teachers, Ian and Barbara, took a little too much interest in the extraordinary girl's home life, they accidentally stumbled into the Doctor's world and his time machine, the TARDIS. By the way, that stands for time and relative dimension in space. Most people think dimension is plural, but nope, it's not. I'm a huge nerd. Anyway, the TARDIS is bigger on the inside than out. So yeah, the relative dimension thing. It's long been stated that children would watch the series from behind the couch because the stories were often full of peril and often featured a monster of the week. The series was told in a serial format. That means most of the time, the episodes would end on cliffhangers, and you'd have to come back the following Saturday to watch how the Doctor either got himself out of the trouble or how he saved one of his traveling companions, which were usually younger women who could act as a character sharing the viewer's perspective and points of view. The series started with a 4-part story called An Unearthly Child. It's a fairly unremarkable story, mostly set up to let us get to know our main characters, the Doctor, Susan, Ian, and Barbara, and the concept of the time travel shtick of the series. It was the second 7-part story that would make the series a massive hit. That serial was called The Daleks, and it featured the first, most deadly, and most popular villain of the series, the titular Daleks, a robotic life form that encased the radioactive remains of a race of aliens that had been in a centuries-long nuclear war against another race of their homeworld, Skaro. The Daleks have only one drive in their entire existence, and that is to exterminate. Most of the serials that made up the 155 stories of the original classic run of Doctor Who were a bit of a range in the number of episodes to tell each story. The most common lengths were either 4 or 6 parts. There were a few 7-parters, some 2-parters, and serials that were 8, 10, or even 12 parts in length. Most of the time, the number of episodes were determined by the length of each season, the budget, and the story scripts, and so forth. When the show returned in 2005, the modern-day way of telling stories is vastly different than it was in the original run of the series that ended in 1989. The 2005 series still runs today and is mostly made up of single 45 to 50-minute episodes with the occasional 2-part story and a very common season-long arc that ultimately makes up a larger story that everything happens within. Now, I grew up on the classic series. It's easily one of my favorite shows that ever was. It was most commonly run in the central Indiana area on our PBS station, WFYI Channel 20, on Sunday afternoons. There were times that it ran on weeknights in its original single episode parts, and other times that it ran on late night Saturdays. But it was on Sundays that I would usually see Tom Baker's Fourth Doctor, perhaps one of the most famous portrayals of any character of all time, on a worldwide stage between the mid-70s and the end of the 20th century. But in the late 80s, when it ran weeknightly, that's when I would get to know Peter Davison's Fifth Doctor and Colin Baker's Sixth Doctor. Channel 20 eventually began to run several stories that still existed from the first and second Doctors, but there was a period in time, about 6 months, somewhere around 1987 or 1988, I don't remember exactly, in which Channel 20 played the serials that made up the adventures of Jon Pertwee as the third Doctor. Pertwee's debonair attitude, expressive face, and even his lisp that he talked with in his more posh dialect made him my favorite right away. Add to that his Venusian Aikido, his crushed velvet smoking jacket, and the frills that adorned his shirt, and this Doctor was interesting to watch, and not just for the usual adventure and the monsters and such. What made Pertwee's run that much more interesting was that, for most of it, he was tethered to the Earth without a way to leave it due to his previous incarnation's transgressions against his Time Lord people's rules of strict non-interference. His only home was to stay with a quasi-militaristic group called UNIT that often worked on more alien and supernatural type missions. The Doctor is staunchly anti-military, and he was living on a military base with the honorary title of being UNIT's scientific advisor. Now, I could go on for hours talking about Doctor Who as a whole, but let's talk about the serial I've chosen as the first to cover on Monster Mondays, The Dæmons. And yes, we'll talk about the spelling and pronunciation and what is this kind of creature in regular folklore later. And you can pronounce this serial as either the Demons or the Dæmons. I'll talk about that too. Jon Pertwee was coming to the close of his second of 5 seasons as the Doctor. At that point in time, he was the longest serving Doctor. Now, he was extremely popular, and the show was beginning to be exported to other countries more and more, and the fan base was expanding by leaps and bounds. And now, in the early summer of 1971, Doctor Who was coming to the conclusion of its 8th season. In this 8th season, the Doctor would face off against only one enemy that he had faced in the previous season, the plastic killer androids known as the Autons. Now, the reason why is because he had a season-long, brand-new recurring villain called the Master. The Master was a rival Time Lord from their home world of Gallifrey. The Doctor and the Master had known each other for centuries as well. Now, also, it should be known that while most Gallifreyans and Time Lords in particular seem to kind of go by these names like the Doctor or the Master, typically, and it's been at least mentioned offhandedly a little bit, is that these were titles that were granted to these people. So the Doctor, that's not his real name. The Master isn't his real name, but those were titles that they earned by way of their studies and so forth. But I digress. Season 8 would conclude with a very peculiar story for the series. Producer Barry Letts wanted to write a story that would deal with black magic. He felt this would not only be interesting, but quite frightening. And especially because the Doctor was not somebody who believed in magic or anything like that. Everything had to have a scientific explanation for things. However, script editor Terrence Dicks, a longtime contributor for Doctor Who and someone who wrote several novelizations for the serials that gave him near encyclopedic knowledge of the series, worried this would upset religious viewers. The Dæmons would be made, but it was given a more scientific slant and removed direct references or settings to churches. What would come out of this would be something almost more along the lines of what Hammer Film Productions would make, but with the Doctor Who characters and sensibilities. For many, many years, the only way I could see this episode was in black and white, as most broadcast tapes that had the colored film prints were thought to be lost or destroyed, since the BBC had no process or precedent for keeping televised programs after their usefulness as either first or second run reruns. Now, if you can ever see the serial in black and white, it adds a wholly new dimension to the folklore, the folk horror element that is woven into the story. But this serial would go on to be a major success. Jon Pertwee himself always said this was his favorite without question. In fact, he would say this so often over the years that it was obvious that he had a great deal of love for the story. This is also routinely listed among the best ever Doctor Who stories. Nicholas Courtney, the much beloved actor who played the military stalwart Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart, even named his autobiography after a seemingly throwaway line in this serial, in which he instructs a member of his squadron to shoot at this stone creature that looks like a gargoyle with the line, 5 rounds rapid. So, with great love and affection often paid to Doctor Who as a whole, and this story in particular, we should probably dive into the demons. Now, on a stormy night, an old man in the small village of Devil's Inn and the old man's dog are killed by an unseen assailant. A local white witch, Miss Hawthorne, proclaims that she knew the old man died of fright, not as what the town doctor said of heart failure. Miss Hawthorne also knows stuff with runes and whatnot. Again, she's a white witch. She also desperately wants the town to not open an old burial mound that has been excavated. Meanwhile, the doctor is hanging out with Joe Grant, his current companion, who assists him while on unit grounds. And also Joe Grant, played by Katie Manning, is one of the sweetest of his companions. Sadly, she's often called an idiot during her run, but she's very Maud. She's very much what the viewers would have appreciated the most, and she is absolutely considered to be John Pertwee's primary companion, and she's among a lot of the classic fans' favorite companions as well. But she's really excited about this opening of the so-called Devil's Hump. The Doctor has no belief in anything that is supernatural. He believes only in what can be created and explained by science, and when he learns that the Devil's Hump is in Devil's Inn, he begins to change his tune and wants to watch the broadcast of the opening of the said hump. The Devil's Hump is going to be open at midnight. The expectation is that there is riches untold inside. The plan is to open the mound at the exact moment that will open 1971's Beltane, which is the most important occult festival next to Halloween. And the reason for that is that Halloween happens at the end of October going into November, while it's kind of the opposite for Beltane. Beltane is the end of spring going into summer, end of April into May. When Miss Hawthorne storms into the BBC Three broadcast and explains how the Horned One will be freed if they open the mound, the Doctor has Joe come with him to Devil's Inn to stop them from opening the mound at all costs. Miss Hawthorne goes to see the town vicar and is nearly attacked by a bobby during an unexpected windstorm until she chants an incantation that calms whatever caused the gust of wind. A similar gust of wind blows the sign directing the Doctor and Joe to Devil's Inn to send them in the wrong direction and causes them to be lost for several hours. Miss Hawthorne wants to speak to the original vicar of the town, but he's been replaced under very suspicious circumstances. She's not exactly a fan of this new vicar who goes by the name Mr. Magister. He refuses to call off the excavation. Of course, Mr. Magister is none other than the renegade Time Lord, the Master. He attempts to hypnotize her into no longer being concerned over the Devil's Hump, but she's too strong-willed to succumb to the attempt. Midnight approaches quickly. The Doctor and Joe arrive at the local pub to get directions to the dig site. People think that he's one of Hawthorne's cranks, thinking that opening the hump will bring about destruction and so forth, but a local does tell the Master that the Doctor has arrived to get directions to stop the dig. However, the Master carries on with a ceremony with several hooded and robed people from the town. He begins chanting an incantation, which causes a tree to fall in the way of the Doctor and Joe, so they are forced to run on foot to the excavation site. The Master ceremony continues while the Doctor closes in on the dig site. However, he's too late, and the Master's plan to awaken a being known as Azal has seemingly been successful. Now, opening the burial mound lets out icy gust of wind that kills the local professor, who pushed to open the mound and freezes the Doctor, basically putting him out of commission for a little while. A gargoyle by the name of Bach inside the Master's cavernous temple also begins moving. Bach's eyes begin to glow red as well. Unit regulars on the show, Captain Yates and Sergeant Benton, fly by helicopter to Devil's Inn to find out what's happened to the Doctor and Joe. As they near the village, they see giant hoof prints in the fields as if something as tall as maybe 30 feet or so has been walking in the same direction they are flying. They continue on to the village and find Joe, who has been looking over the slowly recovering Doctor. Joe feels there's something off and evil about this town. Not to mention, no one is outside in Devil's Inn. It's almost like a ghost town. As Benton tries to get a read on those tracks that they saw, he finds Miss Hawthorne tied up, and she explains that something bad is going on and they need to get away. She is shocked to find that the gargoyle statue is missing underneath the church in the cavernous temple area. She explains that this is all the doing of the new vicar. She realizes his name of Magister is also a title given to the leader of an occult coven. Benton and Miss Hawthorne are able to escape when the Master's priest goon is attacked by whatever it is that left those tracks. The creature incinerates the priest, and that also unleashes a sudden heat wave that revives the Doctor. While the Master is excited that Azal has arrived, Miss Hawthorne claims that she saw the devil himself. Sure, he was 30 feet tall, but he had the horns and sure looked like the devil to her. Miss Hawthorne says that she's sure the Magister is behind it. The Doctor knows that the Magister is the Latin word for master. But there are more problems. There's an invisible barrier of 10 miles in radius around Devil's Inn, and if you try to penetrate it, it will incinerate whatever tries to get through. So we have Benton, Yates, Joe, and the Doctor on the inside of the town, while the Brigadier is on the outside trying to get in and get to the bottom of all this business at Devil's End. The Doctor and Joe go back to the dig, but they're being watched by Bach, who is now not just moving his head back and forth or showing off his neat red glowing eyes. He's actually walking around. The Doctor discovers that about 100,000 years ago, something crashed on Earth, bringing this Azal character here. He was imprisoned in the tomb, and just then Bach comes in and plans to attack, but the Doctor holds him off with an iron, it's almost like a little trowel, which he claims is magic, but only the magic of suggestion, with it only working because the gargoyle believes that he can be defeated with iron. Don't ask, because the Doctor will not explain it, and he shouldn't have to, let's face it. The Doctor explains that most beings that show up in the past religions are not made up or deities. They are alien creatures known as Dæmons from the planet Dæmons. They became part of Earth mythology, but came here to further mankind throughout history. The Master is using the Dæmons' power to probably try to take over the world. However, these Dæmons, or demons as they are often referred to as well, aren't a savior, despite how much they have helped us throughout history. Instead, they only help when they see fit to push the human race forward. They could become angered and therefore destroy us. So, how to solve this problem? Let the Master take over or face annihilation? There will be 3 times that this demon will appear, and on the 3rd time, he will give his summary judgment on what the fate of the world should be. The Master attempts to rally the townspeople to his aid so that he can take over the world by saying that basically they can have whatever they want if the townspeople help him. But they don't really quite buy into this whole idea of complete submission and obedience to this new guy to town. So when the mayor of this village basically decides that he's not up for this, the Master summons Bach to kill him right in front of everybody in town. Later, the Master summons Azal again, and whenever that this demon is summoned, it creates a lot of issues to the environment. The demons themselves are able to shrink and grow, which then causes heat waves and gusty icy winds. It can also create earthquakes. Azal appears before the Master to ask why he's been summoned. The Master wants to know all of this creature's knowledge and power in order to rule Earth. Azal will not impart that info to the Master without potentially speaking to the Doctor first, realizing that the Master and the Doctor do not belong on Earth. They're actually aliens. Azal says the Master needs to take care because demons destroy their failures, and seeing how he's the last of his kind and everything, all of this smells like failure to him. The Doctor helps the Brigadier and team outside the heat barrier rig something to basically get into town to disrupt the power that's creating that barrier. While the Doctor gets back to town to take on the Master, the locals start their annual May Day celebrations, and this is where the real folk horror stuff really starts to kind of come through. May Days and maypoles and all of that stuff. I've never seen that in something that's not a horror movie. But the locals end up capturing the Doctor and tie him to the maypole, and the Master has basically poisoned everyone, basically through the use of fear, not his usual hypnotic powers or whatever, to say that the Doctor is a witch and that he must be burned. Miss Hawthorne convinces the folks that the Doctor is a great wizard who can grant them their wishes without the fear the Magister would force upon them. The Doctor is able to show off his so-called powers with the help of Benton doing some clever shooting of his gun with the silencer on it, and the fact that the Doctor can control his jalopy known as Bessie with voice commands that he installed at the start of the story. Azal appears for the final time to present his judgment on humanity and the Master, and the Doctor is quite concerned. Either the Master will gain the power of the final demon, or Azal will decide to destroy the planet after judging it a failure. The Doctor doesn't really have anything he can do to stop it. The Doctor gave the Brigadier and his men the proper plans to build a machine to try to siphon off the energy that Azal is using to exist. That's basically all he can do to try to thwart the Master and his plans. But the Master tries to win over Azal by offering Joe as a sacrifice, but the Doctor, having won over the people of Devil's Inn, mobilizes them to fight off the Master and his followers. Meanwhile, the Brigadier is able to get through the barrier, but the machine siphoning the energy basically explodes, and this leaves the Doctor with only one option: to confront the Master and Azal. Now, Azal threatens to destroy the Doctor for lying about having a second weapon to destroy him. He offers Azal an alternative to destroying humanity. The Dæmons have already given humanity the power and knowledge to create weapons and chemicals and machinery that will kill themselves already. Be it through war or pollution or whatever, humans can be a bigger threat to themselves. Azal decides to basically bequeath his power because he agrees that humans maybe shouldn't be destroyed, and the Master is excited until he learns that Azal will give his power to the Doctor. And the Doctor refuses it, so Azal agrees to give his power to the Master, but not before he kills the Doctor. When Joe stands in the way and begs for the life of the Doctor, it confuses Azal because he's not expecting a human to sacrifice herself for that, and it causes him to ultimately destroy himself. Unit arrests the Master, and the town resumes their May Day celebrations with the Doctor, Joe, and Unit joining in on the festival. Now let's get to the three things I like about this classic Doctor Who story, the Demons. Now let's start with the look of this episode. When Jon Pertwee took over the role of the Doctor in the season before, which happened in 1970, the series had shifted to being shot on film instead of video, which was fairly common for BBC productions of the 60s. It also meant that it gave the series more opportunity to shoot on location and outdoors. Not that it wasn't entirely possible before, but it was extremely rare to do too much location shooting because of the cost of film. Much of Pertwee's era was shot outdoors and on location. This episode even had more than the usual amounts of nighttime filming, which would have been next to impossible on video in the William Hartnell or the Patrick Troughton days. The episode was shot on location in Aldbourne, Wiltshire in April, and the production was 2 weeks, which was twice the usual time to film a story. And it feels and looks like what it was supposed to, the end of April and the beginning of May, as the story takes place. Most of the stories in the classic era of Doctor Who was done in highly sci-fi style sets. Most of the time, you would think about Doctor Who, it would be in these highly sterilized locations, but not here. You're seeing this in nature, and it gives this episode a much greener look. Now that brings me to my second like. This is not your average sci-fi and heavily scientific Doctor Who serial. In fact, while you could say the Doctor Who is much more science fantasy than science fiction like Star Trek was, it's one of those things that most of the time the science things that would be explained seem very unlikely and kind of made up on the spot. However, the concern I had mentioned earlier was that religious viewers may take offense to the occultish content that was written into the plot. They did change it up to make the Dæmons aliens, and from this planet called Dæmons, which all sounds occultish, but it's also kind of sci-fi when you tell the story, which could go along with the ancient aliens idea that was certainly popular at the time and frankly still is. They do a good job of masking a lot of the more sci-fi elements to move away from the occulty stuff by tying this to Beltane and May Day celebrations and so forth. There are a lot of very cool black mass scenes. It's basically meant to be like a cave that these things take place in, but it's clearly taking place in the basement of a church based on every shot and every line about how the center of all the bad stuff is happening around the church in town. But it is still very Doctor Who to think of an evil in the world to have a very scientific explanation. I'm seriously surprised they never tried to explain like that the Nazis or World War I or whatever was caused by aliens or acting on behalf of alien overlords or something. So while this is a very different type of Doctor Who story, that does dance along the lines of being something more cultish like a lot of movies that Hammer and Amicus had been releasing over the past 5 to 10 years of that. And at that time, it does a very Doctor Who thing by turning the whole thing into a monster from outer space or some sort of scientific-ish explanation. Thirdly, this is the Roger Delgado show. Delgado played the Master first, and he played it during the Jon Pertwee era. He was a consistent and constant presence throughout this entire season and appeared in all 5 serials of this season. He would only appear in 3 more serials over the next 2 seasons. Delgado was meant to be a major part of Jon Pertwee's exit from the series, but he died in a car crash in 1973 at the age of 55. And it's always said that Delgado's death perhaps prompted or was one of the main reasons why Pertwee left the series just 1 year later. He wasn't quite ready to leave the role, but Delgado was a very close friend of his, and because he was such a huge part of Pertwee's era, having appeared in 1/3 of his stories, he decided to relinquish the role, which would be eventually picked up by Tom Baker, who ended up becoming the most famous version of the character during the classic era, as far as the Doctors are concerned. Delgado is fantastic as the Master. While I technically knew one of his successors, Anthony Ainley, while I knew that Ainley version of the Master better because of the era in which I grew up and what was showing at that time on that PBS station that I used to watch, it didn't take me long to realize how much better Delgado is. He embodies this evil look without really having to try too hard. Ainley was always over the top as an evil actor. Delgado kind of oozed it almost naturally. His widow's peak slick back hair and his goatee with the stripes of white almost made him look like the devil himself, and arguably he has just as much screen time in the Demons as Pertwee had. It's kind of like watching Christopher Lee in a Hammer production. I'd even argue that he's almost playing the part as if he's doing a take on Lee's Dracula. He's a great villain, and he's omnipresent, not in just this serial, but for this whole season, and to be honest with you, probably the entire Pertwee run. to have it end with him under arrest also is perfect to kind of put a bow on this season. Now, real quick, I do want to clear up the stuff about the title of the serial because it can be kind of confusing. Throughout this episode, you heard me call them Dæmons and demons. The Doctor himself says they are Dæmons from the planet Dæmons, but the Doctor himself, along with other characters, also use the word demons, and technically, both pronunciations could be correct. The AE symbol, where they are connected, has multiple pronunciations. In Latin, it's a long I sound, whereas in English, it's a long E sound. If you ever wonder why archaeology is spelled the way it is with an A and an E in it, but is pronounced as a long E in archaeology, it's because of the AE that in that word that used that symbol originally in Old English. So the title can be pronounced as Dæmons or even Diamonds or Demons. However, what they are compared to is also how they're used in context as well. In Greek, daemons or demons were considered to be forces that inhabit people to help them or possibly provide wisdom. Socrates thought that demons were what inspired things like love in people. Plato was among the thinkers who saw the creatures as motivators. Of course, Judeo-Christian beliefs see them as evil creatures, making you do things that you wouldn't normally do. So again, kind of mixing that motivator type of idea, but also twisting it into something more evil. Interestingly, that difference in the, from where that terminology comes from and how you pronounce it is pretty cheeky and used perfectly in the title of the serial. If you think about how Azal was something that was part of a race that motivated people and helped them get to the next stage of evolution, but at the same time is also very dangerous and could be evil as well. Well, that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. It is an extra-sized episode, and I do apologize that it is a little bit longer than usual, but you can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. On the next episode of Monster Mondays, I'm going to break the seal on 2022 and cover the first Universal Classic Monsters movie of the year with The Ghost of Frankenstein. So until next week, stay spooky.